Canada is striking back with its own tariff measures in Trump's trade war that he has launched against the world.
There's someone who's trying to weaken our economy. Donald Trump.
Like a high-stakes economic chess match, the United States just triggered what could become the most consequential North American trade war in decades. Canada's unprecedented $30 billion retaliatory tariffs, targeting everything from steel to agricultural products, represent a calculated economic counterstrike that threatens to disrupt supply chains across both nations. According to Treasury Department projections, this confrontation could reduce US GDP by over 1%, while consumer advocacy data suggests American households may face cost increases up to $11,000 annually. Both economies now edge closer to recession. The economic ripple effects have already begun, with consequences extending far beyond what most analysts initially predicted. What began as a 25% tariff has now escalated into a 50% economic barrier that threatens to dismantle decades of North American trade cooperation. President Trump's executive action to double tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel represents an unprecedented disruption in the typically harmonious trading relationship between the United States and Canada. This decision, implemented through presidential proclamation, effectively created an insurmountable barrier for Canadian metal exporters who have long operated within integrated supply chains spanning both nations. The unilateral nature of this tariff increase violated established trade agreements that have governed US-Canadian commerce for generations. Consequently, Canadian officials found themselves with remarkably limited diplomatic avenues to address their concerns. When international trade frameworks are bypassed this way, the affected nation typically must implement countermeasures. Precisely the situation Canada confronted. The economic impact on Canadian producers manifested with alarming speed. Within days of the announcement, production costs for Canadian steel and aluminum manufacturers became financially unsustainable. Steel mills operating on razor-thin margins suddenly confronted a prohibitive tax barrier to their largest export market, creating immediate cash flow crises across the industry. Aluminum smelters in Quebec and British Columbia, which rely heavily on exports to the United States, reported that maintaining previous capacity would generate significant losses rather than profits. Canadian trade officials quickly recognized the severity of the situation after initial diplomatic overtures failed. Premier Doug Ford publicly condemned Trump's actions as an unjustified attack on Canada's economy, warning of widespread unemployment across manufacturing centers. These statements followed multiple attempts by Canadian negotiators to engage American counterparts. Efforts reportedly met with minimal receptivity. The timing proved especially problematic given existing economic pressures. Global supply chains were already strained by pandemic disruptions, inflation, and labor shortages. As a result, for Canadian manufacturers navigating these challenging conditions, the tariffs represented a potentially existential threat rather than merely an inconvenience. In response, Canadian officials developed a $30 billion countermeasure package calculated to maximize leverage against the United States while minimizing self-inflicted economic damage. This figure represented a carefully calibrated response designed to create sufficient economic and political pressure to bring American negotiators back to the table. Trade analysts note that Canada demonstrated remarkable strategic discipline by focusing on specific pressure points rather than matching tariff for tariff. The surgical precision with which Canada targeted politically sensitive US industries makes their response particularly noteworthy. Officials crafted measures that disproportionately affect congressional districts with significant political influence in Washington. This approach transforms the dispute from a purely economic issue into one with potential electoral implications, a calculation that significantly increases pressure for resolution. The Canadian government's analysis estimated that the increased tariffs would result in approximately $16 billion in annual losses for Canadian industries if left unchallenged. This economic damage would concentrate in regions already facing challenges, potentially creating lasting structural damage to Canada's manufacturing base. The $30 billion countermeasure package therefore represents not just a diplomatic response, but an economic necessity for preserving Canadian industrial capacity. Canada's $30 billion response represents more than just equivalent retaliation. It's a carefully engineered economic weapon designed to strike America's most vulnerable political pressure points. The retaliatory tariffs reveal a sophisticated understanding of precisely where economic and political vulnerabilities intersect across the United States. Canadian trade officials have methodically mapped the electoral significance of each state against its dependence on cross-border trade, creating a strategy that resembles a political battleground map more than a traditional trade document. Like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, Canada has excised vulnerabilities in key American sectors with remarkable precision. The agricultural industry serves as a primary target, focusing on electoral battleground states in the Midwest. Iowa, Nebraska, and Wisconsin now face immediate export restrictions on their economic backbone: corn, soybeans, and wheat. These restrictions threaten farm income in regions already contending with volatile commodity prices, with agricultural exports valued at $5 billion annually now encountering substantial barriers. In the manufacturing sector, Canada's strategy targets the industrial heartland with surgical precision. Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania depend heavily on integrated automotive supply chains that repeatedly cross the border during production. A vehicle assembled in Detroit may contain components that have traversed the US-Canadian border up to 7 times, each crossing now potentially incurring compounding tariffs. Economic analyses project that these disruptions could eliminate over 150,000 jobs across Midwest states, concentrating losses in communities already experiencing economic uncertainty. The energy sector represents another deliberately selected pressure point. Canadian tariffs specifically target Texas and Louisiana, where refineries are specially designed to process Canadian heavy crude oil. These specialized facilities cannot easily transition to alternative crude sources without significant modifications and efficiency reductions. This targeting demonstrates the deep interdependence between the two economies and reveals how precisely Canadian officials have identified leverage points. Canada's approach also employs sophisticated timing elements to maximize impact. Consumer goods face immediate tariffs, creating visible short-term economic consequences that quickly register with voters. Meanwhile, industrial sector tariffs intensify gradually, generating delayed but more substantial economic damage as supply chains unravel. This dual timing strategy creates maximum political pressure while allowing Canadian industries time to adapt to new market conditions. The geographic concentration of economic damage further amplifies the political consequences. As one agricultural association noted, these tariffs couldn't be more precisely calibrated to create maximum pressure in regions where economic pain translates directly to political consequences. This statement underscores how Canada has exploited America's own economic geography, the regional specialization that makes certain states disproportionately dependent on specific industries. What makes this strategy particularly effective is its alignment of economic vulnerabilities with electoral significance. The manufacturing heartland states facing substantial job losses represent pivotal electoral battlegrounds. Similarly, agricultural regions confronting export barriers carry outsized political influence through their representation in key governmental bodies. By targeting these intersections of economic dependence and political importance, Canadian officials have crafted a response that functions as a political pressure campaign expressed through economic means. While Canada's tariffs on manufactured goods and agricultural products have commanded attention, a more critical vulnerability lies beneath the surface of America's economic infrastructure. The United States power grid silently depends on Canadian electricity imports for approximately 10% of its capacity, a relationship so fundamental yet invisible that most Americans remain completely unaware of this dependence until disruption threatens. This vulnerability represents not just an economic consideration, but a matter of national security and basic functionality for millions of American homes, businesses, and critical services. The impact of potential Canadian electricity export tariffs would be felt most acutely in northern border states. New York, Michigan, and Minnesota have developed power distribution systems that rely heavily on Canadian electricity flowing seamlessly across the border. Consider a scenario where Buffalo, New York, experiences a localized blackout when Canadian supply is temporarily interrupted. Streets go dark, hospitals switch to emergency power, and manufacturing comes to a halt. These states have deliberately structured their power infrastructure around reliable Canadian supply for decades, creating a dependency that cannot be quickly reconfigured or replaced. What makes this vulnerability particularly concerning is the structural inability of the American power grid to rapidly adapt. Unlike commodities that can be sourced elsewhere, electricity infrastructure represents massive fixed investments developed over generations. Transmission lines, substations, and distribution networks are physically oriented toward Canadian supply points. The interconnected nature of the North American grid means that sudden changes in supply patterns could trigger widespread instability. Energy regulators have issued stark warnings. If Canadian electricity becomes unavailable or prohibitively expensive due to tariffs, American electricity prices could spike by approximately 20% in affected regions. This price shock would ripple through industries where electricity constitutes a significant operational cost. The timing of potential restrictions adds another layer of strategic complexity. During winter cold snaps like those seen in 2019, when temperatures plunged below freezing across northern states, Canadian power becomes most critical. These periods, when the grid already operates near capacity, are precisely when even small reductions in supply can trigger disproportionate price increases and potential system failures. Recent years have already demonstrated the fragility of the American power grid through extreme weather events, winter storms in Texas, heat domes in the Pacific Northwest, and hurricane damage have all exposed vulnerabilities. The addition of tariff-induced supply constraints would compound these existing weaknesses, potentially pushing the system beyond its resilience threshold. The most concerning scenario involves cascading blackouts affecting major population centers. Such events could affect tens of millions of Americans, with metropolitan areas in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota facing the highest risk. When electricity disruptions occur, communications networks fail, water treatment plants go offline, and transportation systems break down. Industries most vulnerable to these disruptions include healthcare facilities and manufacturing operations that rely on precise, uninterrupted power. Hospitals maintain backup generation capacity for critical functions, but extended outages would strain these systems beyond design parameters. Meanwhile, manufacturing facilities, particularly those involved in precision processes, can sustain significant damage from even momentary power interruptions. As power fluctuations threaten manufacturing operations, a financial shock of equal magnitude is building in the background, one that targets American households directly. What begins as diplomatic posturing in government buildings soon transforms into painful budget realities for ordinary citizens. The seemingly abstract trade policies negotiated in Ottawa and Washington are about to materialize as concrete financial burdens for millions of American families, with costs that few household budgets can absorb without significant lifestyle adjustments. The economic impact of these tariffs creates a cascading effect from production facilities to consumer wallets. When tariffs are applied at the border, the cost multiplies at each subsequent stage of production and distribution. By the time products reach store shelves, consumers face price increases substantially higher than the original tariff percentage. We're already calculating a 20% increase on dairy products alone, explains Sarah Jennings, owner of a family grocery store in Plattsburgh, New York. My customers simply can't afford these increases when they're already stretching every dollar. This financial burden hits essential household categories with particular force. In the grocery sector, Canadian imports constitute a substantial portion of America's food supply chain, especially for dairy, certain meats, and seasonal produce. Economic projections show staple food items facing 15 to 30% price increases as tariffs take full effect. The impact varies significantly by geography. Northern states dependent on Canadian food imports during winter months will experience acute price shocks. Regional grocery chains in Michigan, Minnesota, and New York are assessing alternative sourcing options, but few viable substitutes exist during cold weather months when domestic production naturally decreases. Moving beyond food to energy, another vulnerability emerges. Canadian energy resources provide critical support to America's infrastructure, particularly in northern states. As tariffs disrupt these supplies, heating costs will increase dramatically for residents along the border. Transportation fuel costs will rise nationwide, affecting both personal transportation and delivery costs for virtually all consumer goods. Manufacturing presents the third major sector affected by these tariffs. Products assembled in the United States often contain components crossing the border multiple times during production. Household appliances, electronics, and automobiles, with their integrated North American supply chains, will experience steep price increases as manufacturers pass accumulated tariff costs to consumers. These price increases will unfold in stages rather than as a single economic shock. Some increases will appear immediately as retailers adjust pricing to account for replacement costs. Others will emerge gradually as inventory buffers deplete. This staggered implementation creates a situation where consumers might initially underestimate the complete financial burden. The impact on households varies dramatically by income level and location. For perspective, while the average American household faces approximately $500 in annual additional costs, equivalent to a typical monthly car payment, families in northern border regions could experience up to $11,000 in increases, nearly 20% of the median household income in these areas. For a family earning $55,000 annually, this represents a devastating financial blow that requires substantial lifestyle adjustments. This geographic distribution reveals the strategic dimension of Canada's response. Border states face disproportionately severe economic consequences, creating concentrated economic pressure in regions that rely heavily on cross-border commerce and stand to lose the most from escalating trade tensions. Despite the rapid escalation of tensions, economic reality presents a compelling case for de-escalation. The mutual economic damage facing both nations creates a powerful incentive structure that transcends political rhetoric. Each day, the dispute continues. Businesses calculate mounting losses as supply chains fracture. Previous trade disagreements typically concluded with negotiated solutions once economic pain reached a critical threshold. As consumer prices rise and employment security falters, pragmatic reconsideration becomes inevitable. The WTO could provide neutral arbitration, while bilateral discussions facilitated by third parties offer alternative pathways. Will North American economic integration survive this test, or are we witnessing a fundamental restructuring of continental trade relationships?